Hi there and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vassy Kapelos in Ottawa on this Wednesday. Tonight, Canada holds, the Fed cuts.
Today, the Governing Council maintained the policy rate at 2.25%.
Today, the Federal Open Market Committee decided to lower our policy interest rate by a quarter percentage point.
The Bank of Canada holds its key lending rate steady while the U.S. Federal Reserve cuts for a third straight time. We're going to break down what it means for economies on both sides of the border with CTV's chief financial correspondent Amanda Lang. Then, former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge and former Big Bank chief economist Don Drummond will be here together. And the Prime Minister's new voice in D.C.
Exceptional public servant. We're all in her debt, and I just want to thank her again for her contribution.
The Prime Minister needs a new U.S. ambassador after Kirsten Hillman announces she's leaving the post. We're going to break down what the diplomatic shakeup could mean for Canada-U.S. relations with two former ambassadors to the U.S. Plus, stagnant or stable?
Well, they've been systematically holding up a number of bills, C2 most notably.
It's clear as this session winds down that the Liberal government has been engaged in political games.
As the parliamentary year winds to a close, is the House functioning effectively or stuck in minority deadlock? We're going to get into it with our front bench, Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky a little bit later on in the show. First, though.
Governing Council sees the policy rate at about the right level to keep inflation close to the 2% target while helping the economy through this period of structural adjustment. Nevertheless, uncertainty remains high, and the range of possible outcomes is wider than usual.
Conditions in the labor market appear to be gradually cooling, and inflation remains somewhat elevated. In support of our goals, in light of the balance of risks to employment and inflation, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to lower our policy interest rate by a quarter percentage point.
Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem and U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell delivering back-to-back interest rate announcements, with the U.S. Fed cutting its key lending rate, while Canada held steady at the 2.25% rate set in September. What do the same-day announcements say about the state of both economies? Amanda Lang is CTV News' chief financial correspondent. Hi, Amanda. Great to see you as always. Thanks for making the time.
Pleasure.
I'll start on the Canadian bank's decision. A, were you surprised at all to see it hold the line? And B, what do you attribute to the decision?
So no surprise at all. And in fact, economists were almost unanimous this time out. And the bank has signaled, Vassy, that they feel like they're in a good place. They repeated what they said last time, which is they think they're in a sweet spot when it comes to inflation. And then, of course, we've had this economic data that was surprisingly strong, right? The 180,000 jobs created and the revisions going back 3 years saying our economy has done better than we thought and productivity was better than we thought. All of that not only bolstered the case not to move. Some economists said to me today, maybe they actually cut too much. Maybe they were thinking the economy was weaker than it was.
And what do you think that says for the medium to long term? Or maybe I'll be more specific, just the medium term, because we've talked a lot about the impact of uncertainty, and there has been an impact to that. What do you think it means for rates, for example, into the new year?
The bank, I believe, is really trying to signal that barring any massive event, it is staying here. So if you're a business and you're wondering about your borrowing rates, if you're a mortgage holder thinking to refinance, this is what you're going to deal with. Now, barring any unforeseen events. So there could be, of course, some cataclysmic trade issue that sends our economy into a tailspin. Our economy and the businesses inside our economy have been so resilient, and I think we'll agree, surprisingly so. We've actually seen an adjustment. We've seen our domestic economy stay much stronger than we thought. So while exports are super important, our domestic economy has done okay, and it's protected from all of this. And my guess is the bank is trying to say, look, we're staying here. A lot of economists, Vassy, are saying this is the level until rates go up. And some of them think that could happen towards the end of 2026. Some think it won't even happen until 2027. But that down is over unless there's some kind of real reason like a recession to do it.
Which I guess you can't count out given all the uncertainty around CUSMA and what happens next year. So, speaking of CUSMA, south of the border, the Fed has decided to cut for a third consecutive time, though because of the difference in the way they report things, we know there was some disagreement about that decision as well. What do you read into it?
Yeah, I mean, the Fed has a different mandate than our bank. Our bank's mandate is purely on inflation and price stability. The Fed does have a growth mandate. They need to look at the jobs market. There are concerns being expressed about job creation. That economy has also done better than you might fear in terms of how it's reacted to all of the tariffs, because, of course, tariffs are paid by the American consumer at the end of the day. And so we've seen either it's a delayed reaction or it won't be as bad as sort of the worst case scenarios. Vashi. Either way, the Fed's walking a different line, which is it wants to juice their economy enough. They're worried about inflation, but they're less worried. They're more worried about the downside risks to everything that's happening. And you saw that in the massive bailout that the Trump administration is giving to farmers. I mean, this is showing up already. It's hurting parts of the American economy in a serious way. The Fed has its eye on all of that.
Do you think that hurt will amplify as time goes on?
It very well might, and I just want to frame this in that would be nothing to celebrate, right? Our economy is so still closely tied to the U.S. economy that we should all be rooting for it to not be scarred by the trade wars. It's hard, though, in any kind of economic theory to see a scenario where it's not hurt. These are artificial barriers to trade. They create price pressure inside the domestic economy. It is, though, that it's being offset a little bit by this inflow of capital from businesses which are promising, at least, whether they're doing it yet, to bring capital to the U.S. and build there. It's not a job-creating kind of scenario, however. None of that capital is particularly job-creating. And so that's where, again, back to the Fed, they're worried about jobs. Jobs may suffer almost no matter what. Even if the U.S. economy does okay, you still may not see great job creation in that economy.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Amanda, appreciate it as always. Thank you.
Great to talk.
Amanda Lang is CTV News' chief financial correspondent. U.S. President Donald Trump, meanwhile, continued his criticism of Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell just this afternoon, saying he should have cut his benchmark interest rate by more. Have a listen.
The head of the Federal Reserve is a stiff, and, you fight that. It's amazing. We fight that, and yet interest rates are going down, except with him, not too much. He did a rather, I would say, a rather small number that could have been doubled, at least doubled.
All right, let's zoom out for a bigger picture now at how today's moves could impact both government policy and household budgets. David Dodge is former governor of the Bank of Canada, and Don Drummond is former TD Bank chief economist. Hello to you both. Thank you very much for making the time for the conversation. Mr. Dodge, I'll start off with you. What should the bank's decision today to hold the line, the Canadian central bank's decision to hold the line on the key lending rate, tell us about the state of Canada's economy?
I think the governor said it best in his remarks. This is different from a cyclical downturn. This is a structural transition we're going through. And the bank is, in a sense, sitting aside at the moment, doing what it can do to keep the financial markets stable, while the economy makes a transition and government fiscal policy and, most importantly, structural policy plays the key role.
Mr. Drummond, I think a lot of Canadians will hear structural transition of the economy and be unsure or nervous about what that means. In layman's terms, how do you interpret that? And how should we interpret that?
I think we put too much attention on the changes of the Bank of Canada rate or the federal rate. We need to look at the level. That's what really matters, that 2.25. So the Bank of Canada puts out an estimate of a range for what they consider a neutral interest rate. That would be the interest rate that's neither really stimulating the economy nor trying to put a brake on the economy. And they've said for quite a long time that will be in a range from 2.25 to 3.25. And they're at the bottom end of that range. So, you ask that question, how does this match up to the state of the economy? And in a way, it matches up perfectly. It suggests the economy is underperforming somewhat, but not in a disastrous fashion. Hence, it's not at 2.75, the midpoint of the range, which might be perfectly neutral. It is providing some stimulus, but at the moment, not that much. The second thing I would say, I kind of laugh or scoff when I hear the talk about, interest rates are going to go up the next time around. We got one big thing to get through, and that's all this uncertainty, the renegotiation, whatever is going to be, the tearing up, whatever is going to be the Kuzma. I mean, this is going to determine where our economy is going to go. And you can't be all that optimistic looking at that. You look at even these rumors, the discussions that they might have had in quotas. They were looking at a quota and then base tariffs are 10 or 15%. And all the agreements the Americans have been striking around the world, they have those bases of 10 to 15 and then quotas in higher range. It's not like there's a playbook out there that looks all that great for us.
Is that kind of the story right now, Mr. Dodge, that the economy is reflective of, yes, all the massive amount of uncertainty that has been created through this trade war, but also is not the disaster that we had anticipated could be at this point in time?
Yeah, I think that's right. I certainly had anticipated a year ago, or certainly last spring, that things would be worse than they are. But I think we are missing the tremendous jolt that investment in IT and IT-related things has given the whole of the North American economy, and will continue to provide an important source of strength on the one hand, higher investment, but then creates an adjustment problem, especially in the labor market, as we adapt to whatever productivity increases the AI may bring us. So we've got these two things going on at the same time: adjustment to the world and the tariff changes in the United States, and adjustment to what hopefully will be technology which will improve productivity and raise over time our standard of living.
Is any type of robust economic growth in this country possible, Mr. Drummond, as long as kind of Kuzma hangs in the balance, or there is no resolve, or the sectoral tariffs remain where they are? Can those two things happen at the same time, or does there need to be resolve on the trade front for that to even be a possibility?
I think we should all be realistic, and I think the government should be really transparent. We're in for a rough patch. We're doing all the right things. We are trying to find different markets. They're not going to be easy to find. Trade more with Europe, sure. Do they want all the 10 models of vehicles we want? Probably not. Most of the European economies have a higher level of productivity than Canada does. They want our natural resources, but we can't ship them right at the moment in an efficient way. Tough to make secure trade relationships with India, China. No reason, absolutely every reason to keep trying on these things, but they're not going to happen over time. And then we have that really Achilles heel that David Dodge just spoke about, the weakness of business investment. It's been weak for a long time. It's been especially weak since 2015. And you have to ask yourself, if a Canadian business wasn't investing when they thought they had relatively free access to the U.S. market, how are they going to invest now when they don't think they will have free access to the U.S. market and may not have a substitute anytime soon?
I just have a few minutes left. I wanted to get each of your takes, though, before we go on the U.S. economy, because I think that's where a lot of expectation setting as far as the relationship was done as well, Mr. Dodge. For example, tariffs are going to cripple the economy eventually there. They're going to hit hard, and that's going to force Trump to change his posture. What is your assessment? I mean, employment is soft for sure. What is your assessment of where the U.S. economy is at right now?
Well, as I said, I think we are seeing much more investment. And it's not just AI, it's in electricity and energy and a whole bunch of other things that are going on in the United States. You've got American business, which is optimistic because they think they've got a government in power that's going to cut taxes and cut regulations. So I think the U.S. economy is going to perform reasonably well. I was surprised that the tariff impact has been smaller in the short run. But in the long run, it's just a bit of adjustment of relative prices. And in the end, what's going to count is whether the U.S. can raise its productivity, and that's what's going to count for us as well.
Same question and final word to you, Mr. Drummond.
I think there's a lot more difficulty adjusting to the tariff shock than we're hearing about it. A lot of it is suppressed. I mean, take the example of the tariffs on steel. The last time the U.S. tried that, they backed off because they quickly discovered there's a lot more operations that use steel in the U.S. than make steel in the United States. There's a lot more jobs involved in the use of it. And you just look at the $11 billion package for farmers. Well, they get hit by the tariffs. That's the United States did that, and other countries reacted to that, and now they have to bail that out. And you know, affordability is the name of the game in the United States. And of course, the tariffs are raising the prices. So we're sitting here watching this as Canadians and wondering, you know, it shouldn't just be us pressuring the U.S. to not go down this path of tariffs. Americans should see it's not in their interest as well. That voice is trying to be silent, but I think you're hearing more and more about it because there's evidence. It's pushing up their inflation and is costing jobs in areas.
And I'm
on that note,
optimistic that the U.S. business will be successful in reining in the excesses of the U.S. administration. So I'm more optimistic about the U.S. than Don is.
Okay, well, we'll end on a point of divergence. Nothing wrong with that. I appreciate both of you making the time for the conversation. Don Drummond and David Dodge. We have a lot to talk about. Thank you. A lot more on this, I should say, and the economy more largely. Our front bench will talk about the politics. Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky a little bit later on in the show. First, though, the Prime Minister is about to send a new representative to D.C. What could that mean for negotiations with the Trump administration? We're going to talk to two former ambassadors to the U.S. There they are. Derek Burney and David McNaughton are with me on the other end of a very short break. Stay tuned.
The ambassador has done a fantastic job for Canada for 6 years. 4 as ambassador, a little more than 4 as ambassador, and then 2 before that, across a huge range of issues. Exceptional public servant. We're all in her debt, and I just want to thank her again for her contribution.
I spoke to the Prime Minister about this, and I said it's time, I think, for me to start a new chapter. We are moving to a phase of our discussions with the United States with the CUSMA review, the Canada-US-Mexico Trade Agreement review. That's going to start up in the new year. And I think it's important that we have someone in place that is going to be here through the conclusion of those discussions.
Prime Minister Mark Carney ahead of what's likely his last caucus meeting of 2025 this morning, and outgoing Canadian ambassador to the U.S. Kirsten Hillman speaking with CTV News last night. She's stepping down, and multiple sources have told us the plan is for former Canada Pension Plan Investment Board Chair Mark Wiseman to step into her shoes. So what could it all mean for Canada-U.S. relations ahead of next year's more formal CUSMA review? With me now, former Canadian ambassadors to the U.S., Derek Burney and David McNaughton. Hello to you both. A pleasure to see you. Thank you for making the time. I appreciate it. I wanted to start off on Ms. Hillman's departure because I know both of you know her quite well. Mr. McNaughton, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on her tenure as ambassador and her involvement in renegotiating NAFTA and the decision to step aside?
Well, you know, I had the pleasure of working with her for a couple of years, and she was great during the negotiations of the agreement. She was always supportive. She's very, very smart, and I think she did a great job. And I think her stated reason for leaving is exactly, you know, it is what she feels, and I think it's a great thing for her to step aside and let somebody else take over at a time when obviously there's going to be a lot of discussions that are probably going to take more than 6 months. And I think it was, you know, she just did a terrific job. And as I say, it was a pleasure for me to work with her. She really supported me and the whole team when we were negotiating things. And I certainly wish her well. She did a great job for our country.
Mr. Burney, your thoughts on Ms. Hillman and her departure?
So everything that David has said. She's a superb individual. She's done a fantastic job as our ambassador in Washington, and probably the most difficult time that I have ever observed in terms of Canada-U.S. relations. You know, she combines trade expertise that are incomparable, strong resolve, and diplomatic tact. That's a powerful combination. And that's why I think she's done a terrific job in very difficult circumstances.
Mr. McNaughton, let's talk about jumping off that, the path ahead for whomever, and the Prime Minister says the formal announcement should come in the next few weeks for whomever takes over. He also described, the Prime Minister today, sort of a window before things really get started in earnest with CUSMA next year. What do you think the most important task ahead of the next ambassador in that window is?
Well, I think you know, there are a lot of things that are likely or could happen in the next few weeks that'll set the stage. One of them is the Supreme Court's decision on the IEEPA tariffs and whether or not they are, you know, legal and everything else. That could change the whole tenor of the conversation in Washington. I think the one thing you've just got to understand with you know, the President of the United States, and particularly in the second term, although it was somewhat the same when I was there, is it's very difficult to predict what he's going to do next. So you have to be, you know, flexible. You have to, you know, it's really hard work. You've got to anticipate that the unanticipated is going to occur. So whoever the new ambassador is, I think, you know, it's going to be a challenge, but, you know, getting to know not just people in Washington, but also people in the business community and all over the place in the United States who have some influence on the political system in Washington. You know, it's a big job to get up to speed on that, but I'm quite confident that you know, Kirsten's replacement will be up to it.
Speaking of sort of how things unfold in the new year, particularly, Mr. Berney, around CUSMA, I want to play for you something that the USTR, Jameson Greer, said today about pursuing bilateral negotiations with Canada and Mexico instead of trilateral ones. I'll play that clip and then I'll get your reaction, sir.
Our economic relationship with Canada is very, very different than our economic relationship with Mexico. The labor situation's different. The import-export profile is different. The rule of law is different. So it makes sense to talk about things separately with Canada and Mexico. My sense going forward is we're already talking to them separately.
Sure.
I have not had a meeting this year where I sat with Canada and Mexico in a room and we sat together and talked about USMCA.
Interestingly, Mr. Berney, the three people who did sit in the same room are the heads of all three of countries, right? Prime Minister Carney, President Trump, and President Sheinbaum on Friday were together for 45 minutes without any staff. But this is a very, you know, a person in an official capacity saying that he anticipates bilateral negotiations. Should Canada resist that?
Well, I mean, we do have interests with the United States that are quite different from those of Mexico. And I've always been in favor of a bilateral approach as opposed to the trilateral, although the trilateral has done some good things. So I absolutely support the notion that we should proceed bilaterally. A common problem that we're going to have is on rule of origin, because the Americans are now making unfounded, including Jameson Greer, making unfounded complaints about Canada and Mexico becoming a dumping ground for China, for Chinese steel, for Chinese whatever. And, you know, that's ridiculous. Dealing with the Trump administration on anything is a bit like pro wrestling. You have to first distinguish what's real between white reality and what is for show. And a lot of what this administration does is for show. We've got to keep our cool. As David said earlier, we shouldn't react to every whip that is made. I mean, this is a president who demeans and belittles allies while he's placating his adversaries. Go figure. I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, this week, Europe is under the gun and Ukraine under the bus. But, you know, next week it could be different. Meanwhile, he's contemplating a war with Venezuela as he pursues the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, go figure.
Go figure pretty much sums it up.
Well, I would only add that the lesson in all this is we have to be patient. We can't react to the quip of the day or the lunge of the day, because you know what? The good news is Trump's popularity in the United States is not what it once was, and it's not going to get any better. when he claims that affordability, which is what most Americans are concerned about, is a hoax, that doesn't really resonate. And so, we have to be patient. By next year, the congressional midterm elections may throw another spanner into the works for him. Then he'll be lamer than a lame duck for the final 2 years of his presidency. So keep our cool, keep our cards to our chest. We've got good cards to play in a negotiation. If it's bilateral, so much the better.
I have just a few seconds left. I'll give the final word to you, Mr. McNaughton. Just very quickly, would you support a bilateral basis going forward for negotiations?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Derek said. And we already have a bilateral relationship with the United States. It's called NORAD. And I think one of the things that's going to happen, some of the tariffs that are on Canada are under Section 232, which suggests that steel and aluminum imports, among others, are a national security threat to the United States. Well, first of all, it's nonsense, but also I think it gives us an opportunity to wrap the defense and security discussion as part of any kind of trade discussion. And I think we can, given what the Prime Minister said about increase in defense spending and given the interests of a lot of businesses in the United States in selling things to Canada, I think we've got some leverage, and I totally agree with Derek that what we really need to do is to make sure we've got patience and not overreact to everything that's going on. And I think things will work out. We just have to keep our cards close to our chest, not do a lot of public talking, but make sure that at the end of the day, any deal we do is a good deal for this country, and I think we can achieve that.
Appreciate very much the both of you making time for the conversation this evening. Thank you to former Canadian ambassadors to the U.S., David McNaughton and Derek Burney. Kirsten Hillman's departure was a hot topic, meanwhile, of discussion around caucus meetings on Parliament Hill this morning. Here's some of the reaction.
I'm grateful to her for her public service. She's been a remarkable ambassador, who's worked extremely hard for such a long period of time for Canada in Washington, D.C. Of course, these jobs are super pressure jobs, especially in most recent years. So I respect her decision.
I would just like to thank Ambassador Hillman for her many years of service, and she handled herself very well in some very difficult circumstances, and wish her all the best.
Ms. Hillman has, I think, done an outstanding job for Canada, and I want to thank her on behalf of the New Democratic Party for her service and I think the superb way that she has navigated what has to be maybe the hardest diplomatic post that Canada has.
And former federal Conservative Minister and Alberta Premier Jason Kenney also weighing in on the Hill today.
I think Kristen's been a great ambassador, done well under tough circumstances, wish her well. And Mark Wiseman, I worked with him before when he was chairman of AIMCO, the $180 billion Alberta Pension Fund. He understands the resource in Western economies. Most importantly, he comes from the Wall Street world of Lutnick, Bessent, Jared Kushner. So I think he'll have the ability to communicate with them in their language.
Coming up on Power Play, as the fall sitting of Parliament is set to wrap up, what's being accomplished? And could an election happen sooner rather than later? Our front bench with Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky, they're all here next.
We've made a lot of progress on a lot of bills. We'd like to get a few of them over the finish line. That's going to require the opposition collaborating with us by frankly stopping the delay tactic.
It's clear as this session winds down that the Liberal government has been engaged in political games. They've basically been operating a deliberate campaign of self-obstruction, literally blocking their own agenda.
4 bills in 8 months doesn't scream success to me. So the answer would be they're not as successful as they could be because, again, they've been very slow to realize that they don't have a majority. I think that 2026, the window for an election opens. I think the spring is when, credibly, it'll be a year after the last election. And if the Liberals are not successful in making this Parliament work, it could be as soon as that.
political sides taken as MPs prepare to head home for the holidays? Are they bringing home much more than the growing prospect of another federal election is the question, though. Let's bring in the front bench for an answer. Jamie Ellerton is the principal at Kanaptis and worked for Minister Jason Kenney during the Harper government. Next to him, that's Sebastian Skamsky. He was the former director of media relations to Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. With me here in studio is Sharon Carr. She's a CTV News political analyst and former deputy chief of staff to former finance minister Bill Morneau. Next to her, that's Laura D'Angelo. She's with Enterprise Canada and previously worked in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's office. Hi, guys.
Hello.
How are you? Nice to see everybody. All paired off there. Sharon, I'll say, as I was listening to those clips, and especially the first two from Minister McKinnon and Mr. Scheer, I had a big sense of deja vu of those final months prior to now, exactly a year ago, where there was total, there was a stagnant House of Commons and we were on the cusp of an election. Obviously, the circumstances were a little bit different, but you do get that sense that things aren't going anywhere fast other than an election.
I feel like part of it is pandering. I think everyone wants to keep folks at the edges of their seats to say there's going to be an election. There's a high probability that there will be an election in the next year or so. Is it going to be sooner than later? I doubt it. The Conservatives don't necessarily want one or need one. The NDP is kind of not in any position to actually have one. So I think that there's a lot of posturing and pandering going on. But there are a few things that can determine whether or not an election is happening. So I think we just heard some good political talking points from both Don Davies and Andrew Scheer about what it'll look like. But I think the Liberals feel pretty confident that there's not an election anytime soon.
I sort of take a tiny variance of a view, Laura, in that I think that they are maybe confident that there's not going to be an election forced on them anytime soon, but they're happy to go to one. Like, I think that they, of all the parties, would rather have one sooner than later.
I think certainly right now, if there was an election, they'd benefit the most, right?
They think they would. I don't know for sure, but they think so.
I'd like to think
you
they
think
would.
so. Okay, yeah.
But I certainly think they would mind it the least, right? They definitely have the most infrastructure right now from a party perspective. They have a lot to run on from the past, whatever it is, 8 months or so. And they're kind of in the motions already, right? They're already in the news cycle. They are actually making pretty good moves on a bunch of files that Canadians care about. And I think that they probably have this sense that they're a little bit ahead of the 8 ball. Whether that's true or not would remain to be seen.
I think the other big clue I have, Sebastian, though, is that there's not a whole ton of effort behind the scenes other than some pretty specific instances, for example, on C9 with the Bloc or on the budget with Elizabeth May, to gain the support of opposition parties in order to advance a legislative agenda. Like, most of the time, the message appears to be like, here it is type of thing, sort of to Don Davies' point. And I'm not saying this in a negative way, but like you feel like they act as though it's a majority. And that leads me to believe that they think they could win one sooner rather than later.
Well, Vashi, this is a not unexpected Liberal brand of arrogance, I think, on display on the part of the Prime Minister and Minister McKinnon and the entirety of their caucus. Of course, I think, they have been self-sabotaging in a sense on major pieces of legislation, as Mr. Scheer had pointed out in his press conference, where they have pulled ministers, they have unilaterally closed down committees to prevent ministers and others from appearing and testifying. And I think what that shows is that there's a real division in the Liberal caucus on major parts of their policy platform. That push comes to shove when they have to actually bring to a vote, as we saw with the vote on their MOU wording from yesterday, where things get very delicate for them. And I think a big part of this is wanting to avoid bringing those conflicts out into the open air. Of course, they've already had Stephen Guilbeault resign from cabinet over their policies. And so I think they're trying to hold their cards close to their chest and reserve some of that embarrassment.
Is it, though, to their detriment, Jamie, do you think, strategically, not to be conceding a lot to opposition parties?
To their detriment? No, I actually don't think it is, Vashi. I think every day that Mark Carney
That's what I'm asking.
Every day that Mark Carney is Prime Minister and Pierre Poilievre or someone else is not, is a day that he gets more runway to deliver on his agenda. And I think when you look at the broader, for lack of a better term, political malaise right now, Canadians don't know what to make of what the future holds as a result of what's going on with the U.S. Canadians are kind of frustrated, and I think cynically are really fed up with a lot of their political leaders writ large. And I think when you look at the polling right now, I think think both the Liberals and the Conservatives have done a decent job of preaching to those who voted for them last time and are keeping them on side, but not much movement otherwise. And so when those leadership numbers continue to show a gap between Carney and Poilievre, I think the Liberals are happy with that. And so I think the question for the Conservatives becomes, how do you grow beyond the kind of playbook that we've seen from Pierre Poilievre now for the past couple of years? How does he get back onto his front feet and actually alter the dynamics of how Parliament's functioning and be less of like the parliamentary games of winning an argument every day, where he thinks he's getting the clips for social, but actually growing the Conservative fold and building trust in his own personal numbers as someone fit to lead in the eyes of Canadians so that they can start to see him as Prime Minister.
Sebastian, I'm going to throw back to you actually before I get the ladies in. What do you think of that question? Don't be surprised, it happens. What do you think of the question in the specter of what Jamie just raises?
Look, I think some of those are fair points. I think, listen, the role of the opposition inherently is to oppose and point out what the shortcomings of the government and the policies they are bringing forward. So I think it's difficult to judge that on any other scale than his ability to hold the government to account, which I think now that he's back in the House of Commons, Pierre Poilievre has done an exceptional job of forcing important changes and revisions and entire Liberal bills to be pulled and rethought. So I think he's showing Canadians that he's going to work with the Liberals on areas of shared importance, such as bail reform, but that they don't go nearly far enough in delivering that and delivering positive results for Canada.
You know, sorry, pardon me, I didn't think I was interrupting. My apologies. I was just going to jump off that point and say, you know, what's really interesting is how little each of the parties, like at the party level, their numbers have moved since the election. Like they have, to both Jamie and Sebastian's point, really retained the support that they came out of that election with, Sharon.
Yeah, and I think that it's for two different reasons. You have Pierre Poilievre, who hasn't really gained much on his side because he hasn't actually changed his song and dance. He's still trying to appease the same people. And I think the same folks who voted for Carney are here to give him a chance. So we haven't seen any major changes in numbers, but that can change very quickly as well. The polls are so fickle. So
I love how you're like, keeping your numbers is good work on the Liberals, but terrible on the Conservatives. Yeah. That's great spin. Laura, your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think part of this is that Pierre Poilievre wasn't in the House for a big chunk of that, right? So the Conservatives kind of just stagnated. And if they're stagnating, just given what happened in the last election, that kind of means everybody is, right? Just the way those numbers broke, the way the polls broke. And so I don't think there's been enough movement on anything yet to really see any poll numbers moving both on the leader side and on the party side.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to take a quick commercial break, but all four members of our front bench are sticking around. On the other end of that break, we're going to tackle the latest on the Canada-U.S. front. We're back in just a moment. More Power Play just ahead.
Up with the idea of radical open doors, liberal immigration that overwhelmed our healthcare, housing, and job market. Well, it turns out it was Mark Wiseman. Why is that every time somebody comes along with an idea that harms Canadians and drives up their cost of living, the Prime Minister gives them a promotion?
I wish to reiterate my thanks to our outgoing ambassador to the United States of America, Kirsten Hillman, who has furnished incredible, loyal, and very insightful services to the people and to the government of Canada.
Debate in the House of Commons after Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, announced she's stepping down. Then today, Donald Trump's trade representative, Jamieson Greer, floated a big change to the trade talks she's stepping away from, suggesting the U.S. could swap trilateral North American trade negotiations for separate deals with both Canada and Mexico.
Our economic relationship with Canada is very, very different than our economic relationship with Mexico. The labor situation's different. The import-export profile is different. The rule of law is different. So it makes sense to talk about things separately with Canada and Mexico. My sense going forward is we're already talking to them separately.
Sure.
I have not had a meeting this year where I sat with Canada and Mexico in a room and we sat together and talked about USMCA.
Let's bring back our front bench. Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky. Jamie, I'll start with you. Your initial reaction to the departure of Ms. Hillman and now the likelihood of Mark Wiseman, replacing her.
Yeah, on the front end of that, Vashti, I'm not really surprised. Like, she's been in the role for quite some time. And I think with a new prime minister, given the transition that tends to take place over the holidays where things get quieter and people have a chance to get a bit of runway before they really get thrown into the fire, this is now the time to indeed execute on a change in the diplomatic ranks in Washington if the prime minister wants to make one. I think Mark Wiseman is not a man I know, but when you look at his CV, he's obviously got some business pedigree. And I think he's going to remain a relatively unknown household name in Canada, with the exception of some political rancor you might hear coming out of the House of Commons on both sides.
Unless he becomes ambassador, and then people will know who the ambassador is, but I know what you mean. Sebastian, your thoughts on how this all unfolded, and more largely, I guess, what it means for, I guess the relationship is a cheesy way of putting it, but for the status of what's happening with the U.S. ahead of these CUSMA talks.
Look, Vashti, it's important that the Prime Minister has someone in D.C. who has his ear and who understands his positions. I think it's very telling that Mark Carney, as Pierre Poilievre has very aptly pointed out, has run to the founder of the Century Initiative, a person who wants unfettered migration to this country to inflate our population to 100 million people by the end of the century, and is doing so for the benefit of cheap labor mostly. That this is the person that we would send to Washington. Of course, we know President Trump and his entire administration has views on immigration that are diametrically opposed to that. And so I wish Mr. Wiseman well should he become the ambassador, and I hope that there's some reflection on the part of Prime Minister Carney in adjusting for that. But otherwise, Prime Minister Carney really, as I've now repeated, I think, a dozen times on the show, not delivered
so
on...
why not again?
That's right. He's not delivered on the great deal that he was supposed to negotiate. This isn't up to Mr. Wiseman to do. It is up to Prime Minister Carney, who sold himself as the master negotiator. And if he needs to put a team in place to deliver on that deal for Canadians, I hope he does so, and I hope this is the right person for that role.
The sort of bigger story here, Laura, is certainly like what's to come. I think like the possibility exists for on the positive Pollyanna side, maybe there's some sort of arrangement that happens out of the CUSMA review that provides more certainty. But I think like the realist in me thinks things could get a lot more painful than they are right now. What kind of challenge do you think the new U.S. ambassador, whomever ends up officially taking that job, will have ahead of them?
Oh, I mean, I think the challenge is immense, right? Right now we have Ambassador Hillman, who has a lot of deep relationships in the U.S. She's experienced, she's been there for a long time. But we're in a really tenuous position. We're in a very difficult spot right now in relations and in the negotiations. And this new ambassador has to walk in mid-stride and be ready to go without necessarily the deep historical understanding and institutional understanding that Ambassador Hillman has, and potentially without that sectoral understanding, the stakeholder relationships that come along with that. And certainly some of those are held by embassy staff, but they also have to live a little bit with the ambassador themselves. And so that is going to be a really big challenge and something that the PMO is going to have to upskill that ambassador on right away, not just the mission.
The other thing today that stood out to me was that clip that we played from the USTR, Jameson Greer, who said officially what Howard Lutnick said in this kind of, private talk that he gave to a bunch of politicos a few months ago in Toronto, but that we kind of knew behind the scenes was the U.S. desire. But I haven't seen it this explicitly stated that, Sharon, they prefer to proceed on a bilateral basis. What interests me today in that statement being made is that it comes just a few days after, on Friday, all three of them were in the same room, President Sheinbaum, Trump, and Prime Minister Carney, for 45 minutes without any staff. We have no idea what happened in those 45 minutes, but it certainly sounds like it didn't result in a commitment to go this on a trilateral basis.
Yeah, and this is not actually new. Even during the first rounds of renegotiations many years ago, during the first tenure of Trump, this is something that kind of came up here and there, where there was semi-threats by Trump made about doing just bilateral agreements with Canada alone or with Mexico. Whether or not that comes to fruition, I don't actually know, because he changes his mind so frequently. And sometimes I think we've seen this. Lutnick doesn't actually necessarily speak entirely for what President Trump is thinking, because I don't think anyone knows what he's thinking. But I do think that we're entering a really challenging period. And I think, again, like Laura said, Ambassador Hillman has had a lot of history down there and has been a voice in D.C. to kind of build those bridges. And full disclosure, my firm that I work at has done work and does work with Mr. Wiseman on other projects. So I will say that this is all speculative. We don't actually know what's going to be happening, but we are not in normal times. And it was really typical of Pierre Poilievre to get up in the House and turn this into a demonizing immigration. And I think there's a lot of conversations that could be had about that topic around services in Canada. But listen, we're not dealing with your normal president in the U.S. And someone like Mr. Wiseman does have business experience with folks down in the U.S., so it's not necessarily a bad thing. But I do think that we are in a uncertain period of time, and sometimes you have to make shots on decisions that are not normal.
Yeah, certainly. Like, I think if it ends up being Mr. Wiseman, there'll be a great public debate about the attributes he brings and the the positions he's staked on immigration. I do take Sebastian's point that you can agree or disagree with that position, but certainly we know it is very different from the position espoused by President Trump. So who knows how that works out? I've got time for one final word, and I'm gonna throw it to Jamie on this bilateral thing. I just interviewed Derek Burney and David McNaughton, both former ambassadors, who supported the idea of moving forward on a bilateral basis, which kind of, to be honest, surprised me because so far there hasn't been a lot of consensus in kind of the Canada-U.S. community about that. But I wonder if that's where this thing is headed.
It sounds like it could, Vashti, and I think Canada's just going to have to take a real clear assessment as to what that would look like. When you think of Mexico, aside from people going in and enjoying warmer locations during the winter, the inbound of agricultural products that come into Canada so that we actually have fresh produce all winter would obviously be a huge part of that. We know increasingly a lot of the auto manufacturing is taking place there, and country of origin labels are all part of that. So for job number one for I think the federal government right now is to preserve as much market access as possible for Canadian goods and services. Number two is how do you continue to have some kind of continental coherence? And then number three, which is probably, although not the greatest in terms of economic, the most important for Canada's long-term prosperity, is diversifying Canada's markets elsewhere so that we're less dependent on the U.S. and can really flex Canadian sovereignty in a way I think most Canadians could get behind.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate a great discussion. Laura, D'Angelo, Sharon Carr, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky, our wonderful front bench. We're back in just a moment right here on Power Play. Welcome back to Power Play. Our takeaway today, all about the different decisions by central banks in Canada and the United States. The Canadian Central Bank deciding to hold the line on interest rates, keeping the key lending rate at 2.25%, where it's been since September. On the other hand, you have the U.S. Fed deciding to cut its key lending rate for the third consecutive time. And there are, of course, there is, of course, I should say, speculation that more could be in store, particularly as political pressure from U.S. President Donald Trump on the Fed and the Fed's chair, Jerome Powell, amps up. So we'll certainly keep our eye on that. A lot of economic instability right now in the United States, and a little less so, though, a ton of uncertainty around what's to come with CUSMA renegotiations next year here in Canada. I'm going to leave Power Play there. I'm Vashti Kapelis. Thanks so much for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your night.